Welcome to Biology 371. In this first lecture, we'll give a basic overview of genetics and describe how it relates to other fields within biology. Genetics is an ancient human activity. Humans have been manipulating crop plants and animals for a very, very long period of time. In fact, there's very little food left in the grocery store that has not been subject to genetic breeding in some way, shape, or form. Long before genetically modified organisms came on the scene, humans have been modifying organisms genetically through classical breeding techniques. Modern transmission genetics, on the other hand, dates back to 1900, when the work of Gregor Mendel, a scientist that we will examine in a later lecture, was rediscovered independently by 3 different botanists. Modern transmission genetics seeks to answer a few basic questions. Why are organisms the way they are? Or put another way, what underlies faithful reproduction of form? Why is it that offspring tend to resemble their parents more than the population at large? Another key question is, why are there differences within groups of related organisms? Or, to put another way, faithful reproduction of form is not perfect. There's variation within reproduction. These questions were later broadened and subsumed into evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is the broadest organizing theory within biology, and genetics, accordingly, is a subset of evolutionary theory, something that we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. This course presumes a working knowledge of DNA structure, replication, transcription, and translation, the sorts of things that should have been covered in your first-year biology course. If this material is not familiar to you, or if you feel you need a refresher on it, please see figures 1.4 through 1.11 in the textbook. We are not going to focus on the precise details of how these processes occur at the biochemical level. Primarily, our interest in this course is understanding how these features of DNA replication apply to these central questions of faithful reproduction of form and variation. Transmission genetics within a species and transmission genetics across species, or evolution, is somewhat of an arbitrary distinction of convenience. As we've just mentioned, genetics is actually a subset of evolutionary theory. Organisms are related not only to other members of their own species, but also to other species. The species concept is an attempt to draw a line on what is in reality a gradient over time. Another feature of evolution is that life comes to us in nested hierarchies or nested sets that make sense in terms of genetic relatedness and variation over time, the loss and gain of characteristics in a group of related species. Put another way, the central questions of genetics, faithful reproduction of form, and variation also apply across species, and evolutionary biology is the enterprise in science that attempts to understand this. Now, as an aside, for students interested in evolutionary theory, there's a new course at Trinity Western, Biology 226, which will run in the spring, which explores these issues in detail. Modern genetics and genomics is extremely useful for determining relationships between species. And again, if you take Biology 226, you will see this in great detail. These figures from the textbook show DNA sequences from a number of different organisms, and show how relatedness goes across these different species, and also the variation that we see in these sequences when we look at different species. In our next lecture, we'll look at the work of Gregor Mendel, the first person to study genetics from a scientific viewpoint.